There was a time when Stephon Marbury was once seen as the future of New York basketball and one of the most talented point guards of his generation. From the street courts at Coney Island, he stepped into the 1996 NBA draft, the draft considered the greatest in history, with names like Kobe Bryant, Allen Iverson, and Steve Nash. Stephon was selected fourth overall and quickly became a star with the Minnesota Timberwolves and then the Phoenix Suns. He was selected to the NBA All-Star Game twice, had multiple seasons averaging more than 20 points and nearly 9 assists per game, and became one of the most explosive offensive point guards of the early 2000s. In New York, he was once viewed as the savior of the New York Knicks, the street kid returning home to save Madison Square Garden. But what made Stephon Marbury special wasn't just his NBA career. After he was almost completely rejected by American basketball, he went to China and pulled off an unimaginable comeback with the Beijing Ducks. Stephon won multiple CBA championships, became a sports legend in Beijing, had a statue built in his honor, and became one of the few American athletes beloved by the Chinese people like a native. From a poor kid in Brooklyn to a global icon, Stephon had touched something millions of Americans only dared to dream about. But behind the bright lights, the titles, and the cheers was a pain that very few ever saw. In 2009, the whole country laughed when Stephon Marbury cried on livestream and did strange things in front of the camera, but no one understood that it was the moment a man was completely breaking down from the inside. The pressure of having to save his entire family since he was a child, the death of the brother he loved most, betrayals in relationships, the New York media crushing him every day, and the feeling of the entire NBA turning its back on him had turned Stephon into a man living in loneliness and disorientation for many years. There were nights he barely slept, mornings he didn't want to step out of the house, moments he believed the whole world just wanted to see him fail. The most heartbreaking part is that Stephon never really stopped fighting. Even when mocked, called selfish, crazy, or a failure, he kept getting back up time after time. When America abandoned him, Stephon took what was left of his life to China and started over in silence. It was in the place farthest from home that he finally found respect, love, and the feeling that he truly belonged somewhere. If Stephon Marbury's story touches you, please hit like and leave a heart for the man who was once mocked by the entire country while he was quietly collapsing inside. And please subscribe to the channel before moving on to the next part, where we will return to the streets full of gunshots in Coney Island, the place where a poor boy carrying the dream of saving his entire family began the most painful journey of his life. No one can fully understand everything Stephon Marbury carried in his heart throughout his life, unless they have walked through the dark streets of Coney Island in the late 1970s and early 1980s. That wasn't the glamorous New York tourists see on television. It was a Brooklyn full of police sirens, people screaming in the middle of the night, and gunshots ringing out almost every week outside the windows of the poor housing project where Stephon grew up. The old dust-covered walls, hallways thick with the smell of alcohol and cigarettes, broken elevators that were always out of order, and the young men gathering under the dim yellow streetlights, along with drugs and violence, had become part of Stephon's childhood. Before he was old enough to understand what fear was, there were nights when little Stephon was lying in bed and gunshots suddenly rang out on the street. His mother would immediately pull the kids down to the floor to avoid stray bullets. That was how Stephon Marbury grew up, not in peace, but in survival instinct. The Marbury family had 7 children, living crammed together in a small apartment in a poor neighborhood. Money was always tight. There were days the whole family had to count every penny just to have food for dinner. But the most heartbreaking thing wasn't the poverty, but the pressure that weighed on the children too early. His father, Don Marbury, was a man who loved his family but was extremely strict. He believed basketball was the only way for his kids to escape this life. For Don Marbury, failure wasn't just losing a game. Failure meant the whole family would remain trapped in poverty, violence, and despair. So from a very young age, Stephon was forced to train like an adult. While other kids played outside, Stephon had to run for hours on old concrete courts under the summer sun or the freezing cold of New York winters. His father constantly pushed him and yelled at him whenever Stephon made a mistake. There were days Stephon came home with aching legs, but still had to keep shooting because his father said the world out there wouldn't show mercy to a black boy from Brooklyn. Stephon gradually understood that his life no longer belonged to himself. He had to succeed, not to become famous, but to save his family from the life they were trapped in. Amid all that pressure, the only person who brought Stephon any sense of peace was his mother, Mabel Marbury. She was gentle in a way that was completely opposite to his strict father. In Stephon's memories, his mother was always the one who stayed up latest waiting for the kids to come home, the one who hugged him when he cried after his father scolded him too harshly, the only one who made him feel loved rather than just expected from. There were nights Stephon sat by the window watching police car lights flashing outside and asked his mother why their life was so hard. Mabel would just silently stroke her son's hair and say that one day basketball would take Stephon away from this place. But even when he was very young, Stephon already understood a terrifying truth. The family's only hope was resting on his shoulders. That feeling grew with every passing year. Every high school game was no longer just a game. It felt like a test of whether he was capable of saving the people he loved. Stephon began living with a constant fear of failure. He feared injury. He feared playing badly. He feared disappointing his father. He feared seeing his mother continue to suffer in that poor apartment. And deep inside, Stephon carried another fear he never told anyone. The fear that if he failed, his whole family would never escape the darkness of Coney Island. That's why many years later, when the whole country called Stephon Marbury selfish, rebellious, or out of control, very few understood that inside that man there was still the little boy who grew up amid gunshots, amid the fear of poverty, and the feeling of carrying the whole world on his shoulders before he was even grown. Throughout Stephon Marbury's childhood, there was one person he always looked up to with absolute admiration: his older brother, Eric Marbury. Before America knew the name Stephon Marbury, in the Marbury family, Eric was the biggest hope. He was tall, calm, played basketball excellently, and carried the presence of someone who could take the whole family out of the poor projects in Coney Island. Stephon idolized his brother in the way a little boy believes his big brother can do anything. When he was small, Stephon would run after Eric to the street courts, sit for hours on the sidelines just to watch his brother play against older guys. In Stan's eyes, Eric wasn't just a brother. He was like the first hero in his life. There were days when the whole neighborhood lost power or was full of arguments in the hallways, and Stephon still felt safe as long as Eric was nearby. In a world full of violence and instability, Eric was the symbol of the last hope the Marbury family clung to. It was Eric who first made Stephon believe that basketball could change their lives. But the most painful thing is that sometimes life takes away the best people before they can touch their dreams. In 1995, when Stephon was standing on the threshold of his NBA future, the biggest tragedy of his life suddenly happened. Eric Marbury suddenly died of a heart condition at just 20 years old. No one in the family was prepared for it. One day Eric was laughing and talking normally. The next day he was lying motionless. The news hit the Marbury family like a nightmare no one wanted to believe was real. Stephon nearly collapsed the moment he heard his brother had died. He didn't cry right away. Stephon just stood frozen as if his mind had gone completely numb. Then, a few hours later, he broke down crying in his mother's arms like a small child. That was the moment Stephon understood that the one person he always wanted to protect and make proud would never see him step into the NBA. Eric's funeral turned the Marbury family's small apartment into a place covered in grief. His mother, Mabel Marbury, hardly spoke much after her son's death. His father fell silent like a man who had lost all his will to live. The siblings tried to stay strong, but everyone understood a part of their hearts had died with Eric. Stephon still remembers the image of the coffin being lowered into the cold ground in the New York cemetery on that gray day. He stood there watching the brother he loved most disappear forever under the earth, while his mind kept asking why God took Eric before he had the chance to change his life. And from that day on, Stephon Marbury no longer played basketball the same way. Before, he played because he loved the game. After Eric's death, he played like a man running from a pain that could never be healed. Anyone who saw Stephon play after 1995 noticed something different in his eyes. There was more anger, more pain, and deep inside a sadness he never truly got over. Stephon began carrying a strange sense of guilt for many years. He felt that Eric should have been the one to continue this dream. Eric should have been the one to step into the NBA first. Every time the media praised him, every time he scored in front of tens of thousands of fans, Stephon thought about his brother. The most painful thing wasn't success coming too late, but that the person he wanted to share it with most no longer existed. Later, Stephon admitted many times that he never really recovered from Eric's death. It wasn't just a family loss, it was like a part of his soul was buried with his brother that day. And perhaps from that very moment, Stephon Marbury began to become a man living with too much pressure, too many suppressed emotions, and too much pain he could never speak about. For many years, the public only saw a Stephon who was hot-tempered, rebellious, and out of control. But very few understood that behind that man there was always a little brother who never stopped hurting over the loss of the brother he loved most. After Eric Marbury's death, Stephon Marbury's whole world seemed to have only basketball left. But even basketball at that point was no longer pure joy. It became the only thing keeping the Marbury family standing after the tragedy. And from then on, Stephon was no longer allowed to fail. When he entered high school at Abraham Lincoln High School, Stephon quickly became the biggest phenomenon in New York high school basketball. The arenas were packed every time he played. Fans filled the stands just to watch the kid from Coney Island dribble past defenders and score like he was playing on the street courts. People in Brooklyn started talking about Stephon as the last hope of that poor neighborhood. In their eyes, he was no longer just a regular teenager. He was the dream of changing life for the entire community. Local newspapers kept calling Stephon the next great New York point guard. College scouts followed his every game as if witnessing a future NBA star. But the more famous he became, the more Stephon lost the feeling of living like a normal kid. After every game, people didn't ask if Stephon was happy. They only asked when he would get his family out of poverty. When the documentary Through the Fire started following Stephon, that pressure became even more terrifying. Cameras appeared in school, at practice, and on the streets of Brooklyn. Every moment of Stephon's life began to be watched. The film wasn't just about basketball. It was about a boy carrying his entire desperate family searching for a way out of poverty and pain. American audiences saw Stephon as a symbol of the New York street dream, but what they didn't see was a teenager who barely had time to breathe. Every day, Stephon woke up feeling like he was racing against time, against poverty, and against the memory of his lost brother. After school, he threw himself into hours of training until his legs ached. At night, he listened to his father remind him that the whole family was counting on him. There were days Stephon watched other kids laughing and playing outside and wondered what it felt like to live without worry. But his life never allowed that. The more he was praised, the more Stephon lived in fear. He feared that just one injury would end everything. He feared a bad game would disappoint the whole city. He feared he wouldn't be good enough to get his mother out of that poor housing project. Stephon began to feel every pair of eyes weighing on him. Brooklyn didn't just want him to win. Brooklyn wanted him to save them. The heartbreaking thing was that Stephon at that time was still just a teenager who hadn't truly grown up. But life had forced him to live like a man responsible for feeding his entire family. After every big game, the crowd cheered Stephon's name as if he were the savior of New York. But when he returned to the small apartment in Coney Island, he was still just a boy sitting quietly by the window, listening to police sirens outside and worrying about the future. Many nights Stephon couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Eric, thinking about his mother, thinking about what would happen if he failed. Deep down, Stephon always felt he wasn't allowed to be weak, wasn't allowed to rest, wasn't allowed to make mistakes, and that pressure began to wear down his mind from a very early age. People saw the halo around Stephon Marbury in high school, but very few realized that boy was growing up with a terrifying fear that if he fell, his whole family would sink back into the darkness of Brooklyn. Perhaps that's why many years later, even as an NBA All-Star, Stephon still played basketball, like a man trying to run away from something behind him. In 1996, when Stephon Marbury stepped onto the stage of the NBA draft in a baggy suit with bright lights shining on his very young face, all of Brooklyn nearly believed that a final miracle had appeared in those desperate poor neighborhoods. Stephon was selected fourth in the draft, considered the greatest in basketball history, alongside names like Kobe Bryant, Allen Iverson, and Steve Nash. That night, America saw a new star beginning his million-dollar life. But deep inside Stephon, the biggest feeling wasn't happiness but relief. He thought he could finally take his family out of the darkness of Coney Island. In Stephon's mind at that moment, there were no supercars, mansions, or fame. He only thought about his mother no longer having to worry about rent, about his family finally being able to live like normal people. When he joined the Minnesota Timberwolves, Stephon quickly became one of the most watched young talents in the NBA. And there, he met Kevin Garnett. The two young men from poor backgrounds quickly found common ground with each other. They both came from neighborhoods full of violence, both carried anger toward the world, and both believed basketball was the only thing that could save their lives. In the early days in Minnesota, Stephon and Garnett were almost inseparable. They trained together, ate together, talked about their dreams of changing the team's history, and shared the loneliness of black kids who had just stepped into a harsh world like the NBA. Many people at the time believed they would become a duo that dominated the league for years. Stephon began playing explosive basketball that caught the attention of the entire NBA. His lightning crossovers, cold-blooded shots, and street confidence turned Stephon into the new symbol of New York basketball. Shoe companies chased after him. The media called him future superstar. Kids in Brooklyn wore Stephon's jerseys like they were wearing the jersey of a hero who came from their own neighborhood. But along with that fame, something inside Stephon began to change. Fame came too fast for a boy who grew up with the fear of poverty. Money appeared everywhere. People who had never cared before started wanting to enter his life. Stephon gradually lived among parties, bright lights, and the enormous expectations of the entire city of New York. But the strange thing was, the more successful he became, the more uneasy he felt. There were nights Stephon sat alone in his luxurious apartment, but his mind still felt trapped in Coney Island. He always had the feeling everything could disappear at any moment. The fear of failure had never left him even as his career was rising. And then the pressure began to quietly eat away at Stephon's heart in a way no one could see. He no longer played basketball with the same carefree spirit as before. Every game became a battle to prove he deserved everything he had. Every critical article made Stephon angrier than usual. He began reacting strongly to the media, began withdrawing, and gradually lost the rare sense of peace that had existed in his youth. In the eyes of the public, Stephon Marbury was living the perfect American dream. But behind the highlight reels and cheers was a guy barely over 20, who was growing more and more lonely in the midst of his own fame. The most heartbreaking thing was that Stephon still thought, if he just succeeded more, that empty feeling would disappear. He didn't know that was only the beginning of the most painful years of his life. In the early years with the Minnesota Timberwolves, people once believed that Stephon Marbury and Kevin Garnett would become one of the greatest duos in NBA history. They were still very young, both carried the anger of kids who grew up in poverty, and both understood the feeling of having to fight to survive before they were even grown. Stephon looked at Garnett like a real brother. The two would often sit for hours after practice talking about family, childhood, and dreams of changing their lives. In an NBA full of competition and fakery, Stephon believed he had finally found someone who truly understood his pain. But sometimes the deepest friendships break in the most painful ways. When the Timberwolves started becoming more famous, money and power also began to creep between the two people who once saw each other as family. Kevin Garnett was increasingly seen by the NBA as the future face of the team. The media praised Garnett as the perfect superstar, strong, fiery, and with leadership qualities. Meanwhile, Stephon was gradually described as a selfish, hot-tempered, and overly emotional player. Every article, every sports TV show began to create the image that Garnett was the hero, and Stephon was the problem on the team. The painful thing was that Stephon could feel the distance between them growing every day. He began to feel he was no longer trusted like before. When contract issues arose and Stephon wanted to be paid a salary matching his role, the media immediately turned him into the greedy one destroying the team's future. No one mentioned that Stephon was also just a kid from Brooklyn trying to protect his family's future. No one talked about the pressure he had carried since childhood. People just wanted a villain, and Stephon Marbury became the perfect choice for that role. Every day he turned on the TV, Stephon saw his name being criticized on ESPN. TV hosts called him a selfish point guard. The press said Stephon couldn't play with other stars. As time went on, he increasingly felt the whole NBA was siding with Garnett while he was being pushed out. What hurt Stephon the most wasn't the articles. It was starting to feel like Kevin was also pulling away. Their close conversations disappeared. The atmosphere in the locker room completely changed. Stephon no longer felt he belonged there. There were games where he sat silently afterward, watching his teammates talk to each other while he felt like an outsider. The loneliness that had existed since childhood in Brooklyn began to return to his mind. Stephon was always the type who lived by emotion. He loved deeply and hurt deeply when he felt betrayed. So when his friendship with Garnett broke, Stephon almost saw it as another family loss. In the many years after, he rarely mentioned Kevin without sadness in his eyes. Perhaps a part of Stephon never accepted that the brother who once promised to change the NBA with him ended up standing on the opposite side. When Stephon left Minnesota, he carried the feeling that he had been abandoned. And that was also the time he began to lose faith in people. Stephon became more defensive, quicker to anger, and harder to open up to anyone. In the eyes of the public, he was just an NBA star with a big ego. But deep inside, Stephon was like a man who had just lost the most important relationship of his life in front of millions of viewers. The most heartbreaking thing was that the breakup didn't happen in silence. It happened in front of the whole country. The media turned it into a public war where Stephon was crucified as the one who ruined everything. And from then on, Stephon Marbury's image in the NBA was no longer the boy carrying the Brooklyn dream. He began to become the man the entire league gradually turned its back on. When Stephon Marbury was traded to the New York Knicks in 2004, all of New York exploded as if the city had finally found its lost son. For Stephon, it wasn't just an NBA trade. It was the biggest dream of his life becoming reality. The boy who grew up amid gunshots in Coney Island was now about to wear the jersey of the most famous team in the city he loved more than anywhere else in the world. The first night stepping into Madison Square Garden in a Knicks uniform, Stephon could barely hide his emotions. He looked up at the huge stands where tens of thousands of New Yorkers were cheering his name, and believed that all the past pain had finally led him to this moment. Stephon didn't want to just be a good player in New York. He wanted to become the savior of the city. He wanted to bring the Knicks back to glory so the kids in Brooklyn could look at him and believe that people like them could change history too. But what Stephon didn't understand at the time was that New York was not a place for fragile souls, and Madison Square Garden was not paradise. It was a place that could swallow a person whole in just a few months. When Stephon arrived at the Knicks, the team had already been in chaos for a long time. Constant leadership changes, unbalanced roster, coaches fired one after another, and the New York media were like sharks smelling blood in the water. Every day, the press needed someone to blame for the Knicks' failures. And it didn't take long for them to pick Stephon Marbury as the main target. At first, Stephon still tried to hold on to hope. He played with all his energy, trying to score, assist, and pull the team out of crisis. There were nights he played through physical pain, but still didn't want to leave the court because his sense of responsibility to his hometown was too great. But the more he tried to save the Knicks, the more Stephon became the most hated person in New York. After every loss, the morning papers put his name on the front page. Sports radio called Stephon a selfish superstar. TV shows kept saying he wasn't the type of player who could lead a team to wins. Madison Square Garden gradually changed from the place Stephon's once dreamed of playing into a place that made him suffocate every night. There were games where the very fans who had once cheered to welcome Stephon now booed every time he made a mistake. The boos rained down from all over the stands like knives cutting into his mind again and again. The most painful thing was that Stephon never stopped loving New York. Even when attacked every day, he still wanted to prove he deserved to wear the Knicks jersey. He still wanted to bring wins to the city that raised him. But in New York, sometimes love isn't enough to save a person from the cruelty of the media and the enormous pressure. Stephon began to change noticeably during this period. He became quicker to anger in interviews. His eyes grew more tired. The smiles gradually disappeared from the face that once overflowed with confidence. There were nights after games when Stephon sat alone for a long time in the now empty locker room. He didn't want to go home, didn't want to turn on the TV, didn't want to see any more articles saying he was the reason the Knicks were failing. But in New York, there was almost nowhere to hide. The press followed him everywhere. Sports radio hosts mentioned his name every morning, as if Stephon embodied every problem the Knicks faced. Gradually, Stephon no longer felt like he was living in his hometown. He felt like a man being hunted by the entire city. What hurt Stephon the most wasn't the losses. It was the feeling of being betrayed by the place he loved most. The boy who once dreamed of wearing a Knicks jersey now began to understand that New York only loves you when you win. And when everything falls apart, that city can become colder than anywhere else in the world. Madison Square Garden gradually became a place Stephon stepped into with fear instead of pride. Every time he heard the crowd boo, he remembered Coney Island, remembered his mother, and wondered if all the pain he had endured since childhood was really worth it. There were times Stephon nearly lived in a constant state of tension. He lost sleep many nights, became easily angered, and felt he could no longer control his emotions. But instead of seeing a man whose spirit was being crushed, the New York media only continued to turn Stephon Marbury into the perfect villain for the story of the Knicks' failure. And it was right in the city he loved most that Stephon began taking the first steps toward the mental collapse that the whole country would witness years later on live stream. After many years of being attacked in New York, Stephon Marbury began to feel very clearly that the NBA no longer loved him. The painful thing was that Stephon had once entered this league as a symbol of hope for New York street basketball. But now his name appeared on television almost every day as the image of a selfish, rebellious person who destroyed teams. The New York press no longer saw Stephon as the poor kid who overcame hardship from Brooklyn. They turned him into the embodiment of the New York Knicks' failure. Every loss had a face put on the front page, and that face was almost always Stephon Marbury. National sports shows began using his name as a joke. TV hosts mocked Stephon's playing style, calling him a selfish point guard who couldn't bring wins. The internet was growing extremely fast at the time, and Stephon became one of the first NBA stars to be crushed by online mockery culture. Bad highlight clips, moments of losing his cool or angry expressions were cut and spread everywhere. The whole country seemed to start agreeing with the story that Stephon Marbury was the problem. No one wanted to understand anymore why he had become so angry. No one asked what was happening inside that man's mind after years of pressure, criticism, and isolation. Stephon began to feel like a man being hunted in the very league that was once his biggest dream. He gradually lost faith in everyone around him. People who had appeared beside him during his famous years began disappearing when things turned bad. Some teammates avoided him because they didn't want to get involved in the media drama. Calls from friends became fewer. Stephon gradually felt completely alone in the NBA. The most painful thing was that he no longer knew who to trust. Every interview could become a headline attacking him the next day. Every angry action was exaggerated into a scandal. Stephon began living in a constant state of defense. He got angry more easily, reacted more strongly, and withdrew more and more from the outside world. There were nights Stephon lay awake until nearly morning, turned on the TV, and then turned it off immediately when he saw his name being mocked on ESPN. He began losing sleep regularly. His mind was always in a state of tension, as if something terrible was about to happen. Many nights Stephon drove aimlessly around New York just to escape the suffocating feeling in his apartment. He no longer felt at peace anywhere. There were moments Stephon got angry with even his loved ones and then sat silently for hours because of the guilt. He knew he was changing but didn't know how to stop. The anger inside Stephon wasn't really just anger at the press or the NBA. It was the accumulation of many years of pain that had never been healed. Eric Marbury's death, the pressure to save his family, the breakup with Kevin Garnett, the hatred from New York, and the feeling of being betrayed by the NBA dream itself had begun to wear down Stephon's mind bit by bit. But instead of seeing a man whose spirit was collapsing, the American public continued to turn him into entertainment. As time went on, Stephon increasingly felt like the whole country wanted him to disappear. He no longer felt he belonged in the NBA. The arenas that once brought joy now made him suffocate. The cheers began to sound more like mockery than love. Stephon once thought that if he succeeded big enough, all the childhood pain would disappear. But now, even as an all-star making millions of dollars, he still felt as lonely as the boy standing in the dark housing project in Coney Island years ago. The scariest thing was that Stephon began to lose himself. He no longer recognized the man in the mirror. The man who once stepped into the NBA with hopeful eyes now only had exhaustion, anger, and confusion left. And while the whole world was mocking Stephon Marbury more than ever, no one realized he was getting very close to the moment of complete collapse in front of the entire country. By 2009, Stephon Marbury had been almost completely crushed from the inside. But the scariest thing was that almost no one truly realized it. The public only saw a failing NBA star acting strangely on the internet. They didn't see a man slowly sinking into a serious mental crisis after many years of living with pressure, loneliness, and hatred from the entire country. That night, Stephon turned on a live stream from his room in a state of almost complete disorientation. His face was exhausted, his eyes bloodshot, and his gaze empty like a person who hadn't slept peacefully in many days. At first, he only spoke incoherently, forced a smile, and answered a few questions on the internet. But the more he talked, the more Stephon lost control of his emotions. He began crying right in front of the camera. It wasn't the cry of someone throwing a tantrum or seeking attention. It was the cry of a man who had been pushed to the final limit of his spirit. Then the moment that shocked the whole country happened. Stephon took Vaseline and put it in his mouth in front of thousands of people watching live. The internet nearly went crazy. The clips were cut and spread everywhere immediately. ESPN, sports radio, and commentary shows kept replaying that image like a national joke. People called Stephon crazy, a failure, a symbol of NBA self-destruction. But almost no one stopped to a much more terrifying question. What must have happened inside a man's mind for him to sit there crying and doing things like that in front of the whole world? Stephon at that time no longer looked like a basketball star. He looked like a soul slowly falling apart. After years of being attacked, mocked, and viewed as the NBA's villain, Stephon began falling into serious depression that even he himself couldn't fully understand. There were days he barely stepped out of his room. There were nights he stayed awake until morning, his mind racing with thousands of negative thoughts. Stephon began to distrust everyone around him. He felt he no longer knew who was truly with him. Paranoia gradually grew in his mind like darkness spreading in a locked room. The most heartbreaking thing was that Stephon almost completely lost the sense of who he was outside of basketball. Since he was a child, his life had revolved around only one thing. He had to succeed on the court to save his family, to prove his own worth, and to escape the pain of Brooklyn. But when the NBA began turning its back on him, Stephon no longer knew what he existed for. He no longer saw a future, no longer felt he belonged anywhere. Even New York, the place he once loved more than anything, now saw him as a joke. There were times Stephon looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man in front of him. He had once been the symbol of New York street basketball, an NBA All-Star, the dream of millions of black kids who grew up in poverty. But now the whole country only remembered him through internet breakdown videos. The cruelest thing was that society at that time didn't truly understand mental health like it does today. If that moment had happened in modern times, Stephon would very likely have been taken for psychological treatment immediately. But in 2009, people just laughed. Mocking videos of him appeared everywhere. TV shows replayed the scene of Stephon eating Vaseline as if it were a comedy skit. No one saw how terrifying the lifeless look in his eyes was at that moment. No one realized Stephon was crying for help in the only way his troubled mind could still manage. In the many years after, when recalling that period, Stephon admitted he had been very close to the edge mentally. He felt completely alone. The people who had stood around him during his famous years had almost all disappeared. The NBA no longer had a place for him. The media wanted to keep turning him into entertainment. And Stephon began to believe that the whole country truly wanted him to disappear from this world. Perhaps that was the most heartbreaking thing in Stephon Marbury's entire tragedy. Not that he failed in basketball, but that the whole world had stood watching a man sink right in front of them, and then laughed as if it were just internet entertainment. After the 29 livestream, Stephon Marbury almost disappeared from the NBA in silence. There were no sympathetic articles. There were no words of encouragement from the public. America simply turned its back on him as if Stephon Marbury had never existed. The man who was once the symbol of New York basketball now lived long days in solitude inside large but terrifyingly cold rooms. There were mornings when Stephon woke up no longer knowing what his purpose was. No more crowd noise. No more lights from Madison Square Garden. No more adrenaline rush before tip-off. Only silence stretched out so long it nearly drove him insane. Stephon began living like a shadow of himself. He spent hours sitting alone in his apartment, the TV on but not really watching anything, his phone silent, and his mind drowning in thousands of negative thoughts that would not stop. There were days Stephon almost did not want to get out of bed, not because he was lazy, but because he no longer saw a reason to continue. Stephon's entire life since he was a boy in Coney Island had revolved only around basketball. Basketball had once saved him from poverty, from street violence, and from the feeling of helplessness after Eric Marbury's death. But now basketball itself was what made him feel completely destroyed. Stephon began to believe his legacy was dead. Every time he went online, he only saw video clips mocking his 29 livestream breakdown. People did not remember the times he was an all-star. They did not remember the Brooklyn kid who was once seen as the future of New York basketball. They only remembered the man crying on camera and eating Vaseline in front of the whole world. That nearly killed Stephon from the inside. He was always afraid that when NBA history mentioned his name, all that remained would be a joke. The fear of being remembered as a failure began haunting Stephon every day. He thought about it when he woke up, thought about it when he tried to sleep near dawn. Stephon once believed that as long as he became a big enough star, all the pain of his childhood would be healed. But now, even after making millions of dollars and playing in front of tens of thousands of fans, he still felt like that lonely boy back in Brooklyn, only now the whole world was looking at him with mocking eyes. There were nights Stephon walked alone for a very long time on the streets just to escape the suffocating feeling in his head. He began to lose his sense of the future. Everything ahead felt empty. The NBA no longer wanted him. The media no longer saw him as a human being. Even Stephon himself no longer knew who he was anymore. He had spent his whole life trying to become Stephon Marbury, the basketball player. But when basketball disappeared, Stephon had nothing left but pain. The scariest thing about depression is not just sadness. It is the feeling of emptiness to the point where you no longer recognize yourself. Stephon began living in a state of near emotional paralysis. There were days he sat for hours looking out the window, thinking nothing at all. No anger, no hope, just an endless void inside his mind. People around him began to worry, but Stephon had almost completely shut himself off. He did not want to talk to anyone. He did not want to explain anything anymore. After so many years of being misunderstood, Stephon began to believe that no one really wanted to understand him. The most heartbreaking things was that deep down, Stephon still loved basketball more than anything in the world. But every time he thought about the NBA, he felt like something was squeezing his heart. Madison Square Garden, the boos, the mocking articles, and the disappointed eyes of the public kept repeating in his head like a nightmare that never ended. There was a time when Stephon truly wanted to disappear completely from this world. Not because he hated life, but because he was so tired of having to continue existing as a person that the whole of America seemed to have decided it no longer wanted to see. And it was precisely in those darkest months, when Stephon Marbury had almost lost all faith in himself and in life, that an unexpected door began to open on the other side of the world. When Stephon Marbury left America to go to China in 2010, almost no one in the NBA truly believed he could save his life anymore. To American media, Stephon at that time was just a faded star, a failure story that had ended after scandals, mental crises, and the live stream that made the whole world mock him. No one thought the man once seen as a national joke would still have a chance to stand up. And perhaps even Stephon no longer believed it. When the plane landed in Beijing, Stephon stepped into a completely unfamiliar world with the mindset of a man who had almost lost all hope. He did not come to China as a superstar conquering the world. He came as someone running away from the ruins of his life. The first days in Beijing were extremely difficult. Stephon did not understand the language, was not used to the culture, was not used to the food, and even less used to the feeling of being halfway around the world from home. There were nights he sat alone in his apartment in China, wondering how his life had come to this. From the boy once seen as the savior of New York, Stephon had now become a man forgotten by the NBA, who had to go to a foreign country to find one last chance. The loneliness still clung to him in those first months in Beijing. But then something began to change very slowly that Stephon did not expect. Chinese fans looked at him in a completely different way from America. They did not see Stephon as a scandal. They did not see him as a team destroyer. They did not keep repeating the 29 live stream to mock him. They saw him as a real human being, an athlete who had suffered, who had collapsed but was still trying to keep living. That left Stephon almost not knowing how to react. After so many years of being attacked in America, he had grown used to the feeling of being judged every time he stepped in front of the public. But in Beijing, For the first time in many years, Stephon saw real affection in the eyes of the fans. When he stepped onto the court in a Beijing Ducks jersey, thousands of people chanted his name not to mock, but to welcome him. Stephon once thought he would never feel that again. There were evenings after games when Stephon sat silently for a very long time in the locker room because he did not understand why people in this faraway country gave him so much affection. While America only saw a failure, China saw a man trying to stand up after pain, and that began to save Stephon Marbury little by little. Basketball in China did not just give him a new career. It gave him a chance to heal. Stephon began smiling more. He talked to fans more. He gradually found the joy of stepping onto the court again, a feeling he had lost long ago in his final years in New York. His teammates in Beijing did not look at him with suspicion or fear like in the NBA. They respected him. They listened to him. And for the first time in many years, Stephon felt he no longer had to fight alone. The strangest thing was that the longer he lived in China, the more peaceful Stephon felt than at any point in his life. Beijing did not remind him of old failures every day. There was no sports radio mocking him every morning. There was no ESPN turning him into a national joke. Instead, there were fans bringing jerseys to get autographs with eyes full of love. There were people who told Stephon that his story helped them believe in second chances. And for the first time in many years, Stephon began to believe that maybe he had not been completely destroyed. He once thought basketball was what caused him the most pain. But basketball in China ended up saving his life. It pulled Stephon out of the darkness of depression, out of the feeling of meaninglessness, and out of the obsession that the whole world wanted him to disappear. Beijing gradually became the place where Stephon felt he truly belonged. The most painful but also most beautiful thing in Stephon Marbury's life was that he had to travel halfway around the world to find the first place that truly saw the human being inside him. Not the NBA star, not the internet scandal, just a man who had been hurt too much but was still trying to keep living. And it was the city of Beijing that did what New York had never been able to do. It saved Stephon Marbury from the very darkness that was killing him from the inside. Gradually, Beijing was no longer just a temporary shelter for Stephon Marbury. It became the place where he was reborn. When he put on the Beijing Ducks jersey, Stephon entered his first season with the mindset of a man who had nothing left to lose. But precisely because of that, he began playing basketball with a freedom he had not felt in many years. No more pressure from ESPN, no more New York articles ready to crush him after every loss. In China, Stephon only focused on basketball and on trying to save what was left of his soul. And then miracles began to happen. Stephon led the Beijing Ducks to historic victories that no one thought this team could achieve. He played with all his heart, as if trying to prove to himself that his life still had meaning. Beijing fans began to love Stephon in an almost fanatical way. The chants of Ma Bu Li echoed throughout the stands every game night. They did not just love his basketball skills. They loved the story of a man who had been abandoned by the whole world but still did not give up. Stephon gradually became a spiritual symbol in China. Each championship of the Beijing Ducks was like a new chapter in his resurrection journey. The painful thing was that Stephon had never felt loved like that in his homeland. In America, he had once been a national joke, but in Beijing, he was seen as a true hero. When the Beijing Ducks won their first CBA championship, Stephon cried on the court. Those were not just tears of victory. They were the emotions of a man who once thought his life had ended, but suddenly found a reason to keep living. In the years after that, Stephon continued to lead the team to more championships and gradually became one of the most beloved foreign athletes in the history of Chinese sports. Then an almost unimaginable moment happened. Beijing erected a bronze statue of Stephon Marbury, a poor boy who grew up amid gunfire in Brooklyn, who was once mocked by the NBA and nearly had a mental breakdown in front of the whole world, now had a statue of himself in a city halfway around the world from home. The first day he saw that statue, Stephon was almost speechless. Perhaps deep inside, he still could not believe he was loved to that extent after everything that had happened. But the most important thing was not the titles or the bronze statue. It was that Stephon began to change as a person. He became calmer, gentler, and much more compassionate than in his angry years in New York. People who met Stephon in China all said he seemed like a different man. A man who had finally learned how to breathe after many years of living in panic and pain. Stephon began spending more time with children and community activities. He understood how terrifying it was to grow up in poverty, so he wanted children like his younger self to have better opportunities. That was also why Stephon created the Starbury Shoe Project at very affordable prices so poor families could buy them. While many stars sold shoes for hundreds of dollars, Stephon wanted children in Brooklyn or any poor neighborhood in the world to be able to wear nice basketball shoes without making their parents desperate about money. For Stephon, that was not a business strategy. It was his way of trying to heal the painful childhood inside him. He began doing more charity work, helping disadvantaged children, and speaking openly about how people need to be loved instead of judged. The strangest thing was that it was precisely those years of suffering that turned Stephon into a kinder person. If the NBA had not crushed him, if New York had not broken him, and if the whole of America had not once laughed at him, perhaps Stephon would never have understood the value of deep compassion like that. Basketball had once nearly made Stephon lose everything, but in the end, it also helped him find a new purpose in life. No longer the dream of becoming the biggest NBA star. No longer the battle to prove himself to American media. Stephon Marbury now only wanted to use his story to help people suffering, like he once did understand that they could still stand up after the whole world thought they were finished. Even though he was loved in China more than anywhere else in the world, the wounds inside Stephon Marbury had never truly disappeared. Beijing helped him keep living, but it could not completely erase the painful years that the NBA and New York had left in his mind. There were nights after victories with the Beijing Ducks, when the arena lights were off and the city fell silent. Stephon still sat alone for a very long time in the locker room, thinking about his life as if looking back at a shattered dream. He thought about the New York Knicks, thought about Madison Square Garden, thought about the booze that had pierced his mind for so many years. No matter how hard he tried to move forward, memories of America still existed like a scar that would never fully heal. There were times when Stephon was walking in Beijing and suddenly remembered the moment ESPN kept replaying the scene of his breakdown on the live stream like a national clown. He remembered the feeling of turning on the TV and seeing himself being mocked by people who had never truly known who he was. The most heartbreaking thing was that Stephon had once loved the NBA more than anything in the world. He had spent his entire childhood running on concrete courts in Brooklyn with only one dream, to become a star in that league. But in the end, the place he loved the most hurt him the deepest. There were nights Stephon wondered, what would have happened if he had played in a different environment? If the New York media had been less cruel, if mental health had been taken more seriously in his time, if people had seen a man in pain instead of just seeing an angry player. But then Stephon understood that life never gives people a chance to go back and live differently. He could only carry everything that had happened and keep moving forward. Many years after leaving the NBA, Stephon still often thought about what he had lost. He thought about how he could have become a different legend in New York if things had gone differently. Thought about his friendship with Kevin Garnett. Thought about the image of the Brooklyn kid once called the savior by the whole city. Sometimes what hurt Stephon the most was not the collapse of his NBA career, but that the best version of himself seemed to have died slowly during those years. There are psychological wounds that never completely disappear, no matter how far you go. Stephon learned that in the most painful way. Depression no longer swallowed him like before, but that darkness had never truly left his life. There were days Stephon still woke up with unexplained sadness. There were moments he still withdrew from people because of the fear of being hurt again. And sometimes just an old video from his Knicks days was enough to pull him back into the despair of many years before. But the biggest difference was that Stephon no longer ran away from the pain. When he was young, he tried to use basketball, money, or fame to fill the emptiness inside. After everything he had been through, Stephon finally understood that some losses would forever exist as part of who he was. He began learning to live with it instead of fighting against it. Stephon spoke more openly about mental health, about loneliness, and about how success could not completely heal childhood wounds. He no longer tried to act strong all the time, like during his NBA days. Perhaps for the first time in his life, Stephon allowed himself to be vulnerable without feeling ashamed. What moved many people the most when looking at Stephon in this period was the sad peace in his eyes. No more intense anger like in the New York years. No more panic from the 29 live stream. Just a man who had been through so much pain and understood that scars did not need to be erased. They were proof that he had survived. And perhaps that was the most heartbreaking thing in Stephon Marbury's entire story. Even when he was finally loved, respected, and seen as a legend somewhere in the world, the part of his soul that had been crushed in New York would forever remain inside him like darkness that would never completely disappear. Over time, America began to look at Stephon Marbury with different eyes. Not after one article or one interview, but many years after all, the mocking laughter had gradually died down, and the world began to understand more clearly what pressure, loneliness, and mental health could do to a person. The 29 livestream videos that had once been turned into jokes were now looked back on by many with a feeling of pain rather than mockery. The American public began to realize that what they had once seen as a crazy breakdown was actually the desperate cry for help of a man being crushed by depression in front of the whole world. In discussions about mental health among professional athletes, Stephon Marbury's name began to be mentioned as a painful example of how American sports had once treated people who had mentally collapsed. When new generation stars like Kevin Love or DeMar DeRozan publicly spoke about depression and anxiety, many people began to look back at Stephon with the sympathy he had never received in the past. People began to wonder what would have happened if Stephon had received proper psychological support instead of being turned into television entertainment. The particularly heartbreaking thing was that as America grew more mature, it realized more and more that Stephon had carried too much pressure since he was a child. He was not just an NBA player. He was a black boy who grew up in poverty in Brooklyn, given the responsibility of saving his entire family before he had even grown up. Many journalists and former players began to say that the New York media had treated Stephon too cruelly. They saw an extremely sensitive young man thrown into the harshest environment in the NBA and then crushed by pressure and nonstop mockery. Sports programs that once attacked Stephon now began talking about him in a completely different tone, no longer calling him a locker room cancer or selfish star like in the 2000s. Instead, there were conversations about the loneliness of black athletes, about how society often demands that men be strong to the point where they are not allowed to feel pain or collapse. Stephon gradually became a symbol for a generation of athletes who had endured too much before mental health was truly taken seriously. What tormented many people the most was that they began to understand Stephon had never truly been as bad as the media had portrayed. He was just a deeply wounded human being, a person who had always lived with the fear of failure since childhood, lost his brother too early, been turned on by his hometown, and finally laughed at by the whole of America while having a mental breakdown. When videos of Stephon in China spread across the internet, many Americans could not help but be surprised. They saw a completely different Stephon, calmer, kinder, and loved like a legend. The man once seen as a failure now had a bronze statue in Beijing. He did charity work, helped poor children, and spoke to audiences with sincerity that the American public had never bothered to listen to many years before. Gradually, respect for Stephon began to return. Not the kind of respect for a perfect superstar, but the respect for a human being who had survived so much pain without completely collapsing. People who had mocked him many years earlier began to look back with a sense of guilt, because the more they understood about mental health, the more they realized Stephon should have been helped instead of turned into a joke. But the most heartbreaking thing was that even though America finally began to understand Stephon Marbury, the most painful years of his life would never come back. No one could give back the youth that had been crushed by New York pressure. No one could erase from his mind the sleepless nights, the booze at Madison Square Garden, or the extreme loneliness when the entire NBA turned its back. There are wounds that only become less painful with time but never truly disappear. Stephon understood that better than anyone. But perhaps it was precisely America's late understanding that made his story even more painful. Because in the end, many people realized Stephon Marbury was not the villain they once thought. He was just a too sensitive soul placed in a too cruel world. And sometimes, the most tragic thing in life is not being hated, but being understood too late, after having to endure everything alone for so many years. At age 48, Stephon Marbury finally slowed down after a life that had almost never truly been peaceful. No more nights with Madison Square Garden lights shining directly on his stressed face. No more New York articles ready to crush him after every failure. No more mocking laughter spreading across the internet like the fateful 29 live stream. Stephon was now much calmer. He smiled more. He spoke more gently. There were mornings he woke up in Beijing or New York without the feeling that the world wanted to push him into the abyss anymore. But what very few people understood was that this peace did not mean the wounds had disappeared. It only meant Stephon had finally learned how to live with them. There were nights he still stayed up very late, looking out the window and thinking about his entire life like a movie too painful to believe it had once been real. Stephon thought about the skinny little boy in Coney Island who used to lie flat on the floor every time gunfire rang out outside the window. The boy who grew up in poverty, under the pressure of having to save his whole family, and with a fear of failure so great he could not breathe. Stephon thought about Eric Marbury, about the day his brother was buried in the cold ground before he could see the NBA dream come true. He thought about New York, about the night stepping into Madison Square Garden with a heart full of hope and leaving amid booze from his own hometown. And then Stephon thought about Beijing, thought about the moment he stood silently in front of his own bronze statue in China. Sometimes even Stephon could not understand that painful paradox. America, the place where he spent his entire youth trying to be recognized, was the place that nearly destroyed him completely. Meanwhile, a country halfway around the world from home had become the place that saved his life. The image of the man standing in front of his own statue in Beijing was perhaps the saddest, but also the most beautiful symbol of Stephon Marbury's entire life. It was like proof that sometimes a person has to go very far to find the place that truly sees their soul. After everything, Stephon finally understood something he had never realized when he was young. Fame and money could not heal every wound. The NBA had once given him millions of dollars, fame, and the spotlight that millions of Brooklyn kids dreamed of. But none of that helped Stephon escape the feeling of loneliness, the pain of losing his brother, or the mental wounds that had existed since childhood. There was a time Stephon believed that as long as he succeeded enough, he would be happy. But then he realized a person could stand in front of tens of thousands of fans and still feel completely lost inside. The only thing that truly saved Stephon was not fame, not money, but love and the feeling that he was still useful to others. He began finding meaning in life through family, through children, and through helping people who had suffered like him. Stephon spent time talking to young players about mental health, about pressure, and about not letting basketball be the only thing that defined their self-worth. He did charity work, helped poor children, and continued the Starbury Shoe Project as a way for the poor boy in Coney Island back then to help other children not feel ashamed for not having enough money to buy nice shoes. Perhaps what made Stephon Marbury's story more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined did not lie in the scandals or NBA failures. It lay in the fact that he had to live almost his entire life feeling he was not loved the right way. From the boy carrying the burden of saving his family, to the young man crushed by New York media, to the man crying in front of the camera while the whole of America laughed, Stephon had always been like a too sensitive soul thrown into a too cruel world. But the most beautiful thing was that he had survived. After all the darkest years, Stephon Marbury was still standing here. Not perfect, not completely healed, but still existing. And sometimes, for people who have been through so much pain, just continuing to live is already an extraordinary victory. Perhaps Stephon would never be remembered as the greatest NBA player. Perhaps American basketball history would always debate his career. But Stephon Marbury's true legacy did not lie in points scored or all-star appearances. It lay in the fact that a man once thought by the whole world to have completely collapsed finally found a way to stand up and keep living. And perhaps many years later, when people looked back at Stephon Marbury's life, what they remembered most would not be the 29 live stream or the scandals in New York. They would remember a man who had endured more pain than most people had ever seen, but still did not let the darkness kill him completely. Stephon Marbury's story is one of the most heartbreaking tragedies of modern American sports, because it shows that sometimes a person can reach the peak of fame but still quietly break inside without anyone truly noticing. What makes viewers feel the most sorrow is not just the 29 live stream when Stephon cried in front of the camera and was mocked by the whole of America, but that the tragedy had actually begun much earlier. From the boy growing up amid gunfire in Coney Island, from the pressure to save his entire family from poverty, from the death of his brother Eric Marbury that buried part of his soul forever with time. Throughout the story, we see that Stephon was never truly allowed to be weak. When he was a child, he had to be strong to save his family. When he entered the NBA, he had to be strong to carry New York's expectations. And when he had a mental breakdown, American society at that time chose to laugh instead of helping him. That is the most painful detail of the entire story. A man slowly sinking in front of millions of people, but no one realized it was a desperate cry for help. What makes Stephon worthy of respect does not lie in his all-star appearances or championships in China, but in the fact that he continued living after all those wounds. He turned pain into compassion, used the Starbury Shoe Project to help poor children, and used his own story to talk about mental health for future generations. For American society, this story is a very big reminder that success does not make people immune to loneliness or depression, and sometimes what a person needs most is not judgment, but simply to be listened to before it is too late. If Stephon Marbury's story touched you, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and leave heart for the man who survived the years when the whole world thought he would collapse forever. Thank you for accompanying us to the end of this painful, but also full of resilience story, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore famous destinies behind the spotlight that America has never truly fully understood.